So you've heard about fight and flight, but are you familiar with fawn, fidget, and freeze as potential survival responses in your dog? Fight and flight tend to be pretty obvious. Flight is when your dog is trying to get away, right? They're trying to hide, escape, run. Fight is also usually pretty obvious. It translates well between the species. In fight, we see our dogs lunging forward, we see hard staring, we see snapping, we see biting. All of these things are requests for more space. Unfortunately, fawn, fidget, and freeze, three equally important survival responses, are not translated so well between species and are often misconstrued by humans. The fawn response is kind of like people pleasing in humans. So you're going to see the dog making themselves small, maybe pushing into the person that they're uncomfortable with, seemingly asking for pets or affection. You're going to see curled up bodies, lowered heads, lying on the side, really stiff with the arm up in what unfortunately is often mistaken for a bid for belly rubs when really it is a request for more space. And then we've got the fidget response. Fidget is often mistaken for overexcitement. It's fast, frantic movements. It's often a lot of jumping and licking, which unfortunately are often mistaken for affectionate kisses. But licking has so many functions other than affection. In fact, it's not generally used to show affection. Fidget and fawn often appear together, and I often see them appear when the dog is in conflict. So I do like people, but they're gonna touch me. Fidget and fawn are both examples of active coping, just like fight and flight. But freeze is actually an example of passive coping and is associated with even higher levels of stress hormones than those other survival responses. So when the system has overloaded and can no longer actively cope, we might see a dog go into a freeze state. And unfortunately, this one doesn't translate well either. Dogs in freeze are often mistaken for being fine or okay or neutral. We can't ask dogs if they dissociate, but a functional freeze is sort of like dissociation in humans. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the dog is like frozen physically, stiff as a board, but they are in a highly stressed state. And instead of seeing hyper arousal, so those physiological responses to stress, that adrenaline rush, like we're going to see with fight, flight, fawn, and fidget, we see hypo arousal, which often leads people to think that the dog is okay when really they are the most overwhelmed. Dogs who tend to cope in a freeze state tend to have lower coping strategies and lower resilience to stress. That's why it's better for your dog to, say, snap at the vet than to be taken back away out of the room with you, their safe person, where they then go into a freeze state and shut down. But we tend to think, oh, it's better because the dog's not trying to bite. And while physically that's safer for the human, it means that the dog is having an even worse time. Negative associations are strengthening even more. It's going to take them even longer to bounce back from that stress. And then where things can get really confusing is that dogs will engage in different survival responses based on the context. So they may be able to engage in active coping when they are in a safe space, like their home or their own neighborhood, or maybe not a safe space, but a more familiar space, or with their safe people. So when my safe people are around and I have social support, I might be able to engage in active coping. But I might engage in a different stress response entirely, either another active coping response or going into freeze if I don't have my safe people, or I'm in an unfamiliar area, or I'm on leash versus off leash, or I'm outside versus inside. And what is harder is really going to depend on the individual dog, but generally mammals will choose flight first if they perceive that they can. And things like learning history, so a history, for example, of being unable to flight, can color the idea for the dog of whether or not flight is an acceptable option. If they get a lot of practice with, say, the fight response working, that may be the one they start to default to. And dogs might be less likely to perceive that they can flight when they are on leash or inside. But it's all contextual and very individual.